my name is Dominique Ryle. I'm a professor of modern European history at the University of Miami and currently the Fulbright Imera Chair of Migration in Marseille. And I have the great pleasure to interview one of the Society for Italian Historical Studies. We call that SIHS prize winners for modern Italian history, Michele Sollai. I'm going to first give a little introduction of Michele, and then I'm going to read the citation that the Article Prize Committee created to explain why they chose this article. And then Michele and I are going to talk a little about the article and delve into it further, just so that you know what we're doing. So first things first, who is Michele? Michele is currently a visiting postdoc at the Centre d'Histoire de Sciences Po in Paris. And he will be shortly moving and leaving beautiful Paris for beautiful Zurich at the university there, where he spend his third of his final year of in the postdoc mobility fellowship from the Swiss National Science Foundation. I think that those are very good postdocs. Michele obtained his obtained his PhD in early 2022 from the Geneva Graduate Institute with a thesis on the history of agrarian development in Ethiopia from the Italian fascist occupation to early post-war international aid. I think obviously this article is based on some of that research. The thesis has received 2 prestigious prizes, the Pierre de Bois Award given by the Pierre de Bois Foundation and the Geneva Graduate Institute, and the Gilbert Fight Dissertation Award given by the U.S. Agricultural History Society. So this article is titled How to Feed an Empire, Agrarian Science, Indigenous Farming, and Wheat Autarky in Italian-Occupied Ethiopia, 1937 to 1942. It came out with Agricultural History, a journal that most of our prize winners don't usually publish with. So it's very exciting to have a different journal in the midst. It came out in 2022. The Modern Italy Article Prize Committee, which was made up of Silvana Patriarca from Fordham University, she was serving as committee chair, Dario Gaggio from University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and Mia Fuller, University of California, Berkeley, wrote the following. And before I read what they wrote, what a group of judges for this article. I can't think of 3 people. The combination of material history, imperial history, infrastructure, and fascism. You got your perfect audience for your article.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this is what they wrote to explain it. The Society for Italian Historical Studies is happy to announce this year's recipient of the Article Prize in Modern Italian History. We congratulate Michele Sollai for his article, How to Feed an Empire. The essay examines the failed attempts by the fascist regime to make Italian East Africa self-sufficient in grain production by adopting a sophisticated ecological perspective that takes seriously the interactions between humans, non-human actors, and their environments. This perspective allows Sollai to nuance the contours of colonial practices and highlight the active roles played by indigenous knowledge in negotiating colonial power and its experimental ambitions. Sollai shows a remarkable ability to connect Ethiopia's brief colonial experience to a longer genealogy, linking pre-existing Italian agricultural projects to the worldwide spread of high productivity agriculture after World War II. The essay meticulously analyzes the complexity of colonial agricultural practices in Ethiopia while ambitiously setting them in a global context of techno-scientific exchanges and political projects. So Michele, I read the article too. I completely understand why you won. Congratulations. I heard you also won from a different prize, the Vermin Carstensen Memorial Award for the best article published in the Journal of Agricultural History. So the journal really likes this article too. And I think that part of the reason why it reads so well is there's this very interesting combination between history of science, history of agriculture, political history, and thinking about the ground, thinking from the ground up and thinking from what are you doing to ground in here that really catches the attention of the reader. Every paragraph is different than the paragraph before and in where we're going. And when you read the citation, was there anything about what they emphasized of the article that surprised you or really hit home with you of how they thought of the article or what they thought about it?
First of all, before we start, let me thank you for organizing this conversation and of course the Society for Italian Historical Studies as a whole and the award committee, Silvana Patriarca, Dario Gaggio, and Mia Fuller for reading the article and writing that beautiful citation. Yeah, I think they have been extremely good in grasping the essence of the article, the sort of the whole argument and approach that I try to have. What you also said, I think, is perfectly right. My intention with this article and with the overall dissertation in which this article was located was to focus not so much on, or not just on, the ideology, the discourse, the narratives, the plans behind what the fascist regime tried to achieve with agricultural modernization in Ethiopia, but like the other side of the coin, what happens on the ground, how do plans and ideas and narratives get twisted if seen from that perspective, and how a different set of actors comes into play, experts and different views, different reactions between among experts, and also their relationship with farmers. So this has been really at the core of my interest. That's what made me passionate about the topic, and yeah, I think the sources have also been very helpful in that regard, because especially if you're doing this kind of history, you can only go as far as sources allow you to. And the reason why not a lot of research has been done along these lines, in many cases, has been because of lack of sources. So also in that sense, I've been relatively lucky.
Well, we can go to sources later, but what I felt while I was reading the article, and what I noticed in their citation too, is it's hard to root for empire or colonization, especially the Italian project in Africa. There's no one's going, go Italy, go. But it is their reduced resources and their continual failures at finding an easy way to feed the empire, create an autarkic imperial feeding system so that Italy doesn't have to cover the costs of Africa, that pushes the state to allow scientists to have a bigger stake in trying to understand how agriculture could or should work for wheat production in Italian East Africa. So it is the weakness of the economic and infrastructure of the Italian fascist state that creates the opportunity to allow scientists who are perhaps more experimental and thinking about ecology and indigenous knowledge and traditional means. And yet it also fails because the project is imperial. It's not to keep everything the same and stable. Sustainability is not the goal on a local level. It's imperial sustainability, which is the goal. And I find that part of your argument so, yes, nuanced is their word, and I think it's the perfect word, it is the failure of an imperial economic powerhouse that creates a project that is very surprising, that is also a failure. So you don't know what you're rooting for. Let's just hope they keep on failing. I don't know. What were you doing when you were reading all of these projects? Were you excited when they were thinking about allowing more Ethiopians to keep their land and farm their land as they had, or were you hoping? What was your emotional relationship with reading what they were trying to do?
Yeah, absolutely. At some point, while I was doing research for this article and also while I was writing, I thought, wow, I'm really doing a history of failure. And there's so much history within failure. Yeah, I noticed that especially in the past, not just in Italian historiography, but also more generally with colonial history, historians tend to stop at the recognition of failure. Like, when a plan fails, there can be no history beyond that point.
Right.
And what I've attempted to do with this article is really try to look what's life in a state of failing of a colonial empire, and what are the opportunities, the room for maneuver that local actors have on the ground once a state, a colonial entity, a colonial regime proved to be weak. So in that sense, in terms of like emotions that I felt while working on this, it's been incredible how these reports from local scientists in Ethiopia that uh, you may think of them, and most often they are very dry, very they are very technical. But what I found instead was that a lot of emotions were involved in those too, because they were dealing with a sort of the denial, the negation of their aspirations, and they had to reformulate them and do them quickly. These have been probably the richest sources of inspiration for me, and also the part that I enjoyed the most about this whole process.
One thing I really liked about the article was that you don't stick to one community. You trace how knowledge is attempted to be produced. So we see a trans-imperial communication between scientists in the different parts of Italian East Africa, the imperial zone in Africa, with mainland Italy. We also have a trans-colonial, as you call it, relationship between scientists working on wheat production in Kenya in the British Empire and those who are working in the Italian Empire. So you are allowing a kind of openness of what is your subject matter and where is your history going based on the networks that you're seeing. Were you surprised? Was there no France there? I kept on being kind of surprised that there wasn't more, that it was so British in what you were discussing. Is that surprising or is that normal?
Yeah, I was surprised too. Although to a certain extent, because I knew that if we talk about wheat in colonial Africa, the Brits were the most involved, mostly because of the colonies that they had at their disposal and in particular environment of those colonies. But yeah, in general, like first of all, the biggest surprise was to find these sort of transcolonial connections, which in the case of the Italian East African Empire and of Italian colonialism more generally have been sort of a little bit neglected, I think. And the most interesting part of it all was to discover, to have the means to highlight historiographically these connections through the local approach, the approach on the ground that I had at the beginning. So it was by looking at things from below, from a local viewpoint, that then the global connections became visible. And that sort of association between local dynamics and global projections is, I think, is crucial for understanding the history of agrarian development in Ethiopia during the Italian occupation.
Yeah, and in some ways, from both your introduction and your conclusion, the importance of this relatively short time period is seen in the success of the transcolonial networks that introduced a variance of African wheat that was more resistant to I guess one says rust wheat fungus that allowed Ethiopia to continue to be one of the biggest wheat producing areas in East Africa, and thereby post-colonial it retained a wheat breadbasket culture, at least in the first couple of decades. from what I understand in your article, this is because of that transcolonial relationship of the World War II period.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, the article both talks about connections over space, but also how these connections over space allow continuities over time.
Right.
And the history of the wheat seeds themselves, I think is a very interesting entry point into this connection. In the case of of the first trials of Kenyan wheat from Kenya into Ethiopia, then they proved to be it proved to be a very good intuition that then was taken and taken further again by the U.S. Point for program in the 1950s. Kenyan wheat even in the 60s and 70s became important in Ethiopia, but not just in Ethiopia, on a global scale, because it was included within the program of Norman Borlaug, the so-called father of the Green Revolution. So other than the Brits themselves who experimented with these indigenous land races in Kenya first, the Italians were among the first also to sort of take these seeds outside of Kenya and sort of introduce them on a global scale.
So I love some of the explanations you give of how local farmers in Ethiopia were brought into the imperial project, either through sharecropping, but there is also these scientists who start realizing that their techniques and their instruments might actually be better at raising crops, wheat crops, and this is what you say, the maresha, is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So this is a way of tilling the soil that doesn't pull it all up, right? So it just goes on the top. Was there ever an idea of using that in Italy? Parts of Italy have very frail soil as well. Was there ever an idea of using Ethiopian tools on the mainland, or was there some kind of just a mental division of thinking of crossover in the other direction?
Well, that's a fascinating question. What I found out later on when I started working more directly on Italy itself, and especially southern Italy, I realized that the traditional plow that was used at the time in southern Italy was pretty much or had pretty similar functions and rationale with the Marsha in Ethiopia, and Italian experts from the 1920s onwards also started making a similar claim about the necessity or the usefulness of relying on these more traditional, but more ecologically sound tools rather than importing modern or so-called modern machinery. So even though the Maresha was not necessarily then experimented with, imported to Italy, then a similar dynamic came into play with respect to putting in doubt scientific assumptions about what machinery is best for what purpose. So there are, other than this, I think we could, and that's also what I'm trying to do now, is to sort of blur the boundaries between metropole and colony with respect to science and technology. So see how the relationship between scientific expertise and different forms, different ways of knowing local, traditional, indigenous is not just dichotomous as it seems, both in the metropole and in the colony. And the case of the Marsha is a perfect example for that.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. This, as you can see by how excited I am by the article is I know it's already been included in several syllabi in Italian history. So it's really making a big impact in our field. Have you shown it to, or have you heard any feedback from historians of Ethiopia? What is the response to the article from the other side?
Well, so I went to Ethiopia to do archival research, and I used that the period of research also to receive feedback on what I was working on. At the time, I still hadn't finished writing the article, but I had an idea, I had a draft. So I sent it over to colleagues and friends. I also asked them for their help in making sure that I wasn't writing anything that wasn't correct. But in general, the feedback was good. I think that, of course, me not being an Africanist historian, me not being an expert on Ethiopia, there may be some inaccuracies here and there, but at the same time, I think that the most interesting reaction that I got is that at least in Ethiopian historiography, up until this moment, the history of the Italian occupation is sort of seen as an aberration from their overall development in the 20th century. It's something that, of course, happened, and of course was an utter tragedy for so many Ethiopians. But at the same time, there haven't been many efforts to connect this tragic moment with the broader history of the country. In my I intended this article as a sort of a contribution to connecting the dots in that sense. It's not an article that it's exclusively about the Italian colonial enterprise. It's not an article that it's exclusively about Ethiopian history, but it's an article that tries to build a bridge between these two distant fields. This was something that was noticed and appreciated by colleagues from Ethiopia.
No, I can imagine. Anyone who works on Italy can't help always being really interested in what Ethiopian historians do with this, with linking the dots. And so it is. I can imagine that it could be very useful to change the story also about what did this do to our land. So you've given us some information, but where does this sit in? I'm assuming you're writing a book.
I am. It's taking a while, but I am.
I'm assuming we're gonna be giving you book prizes soon. So where does this sit in the book? Is this kind of like a morsel of a summary of what the book is, or is it one part and it's different? This is when you're supposed to talk.
Of course, yeah.
Don't keep on watching me give the answers.
Well, originally the article was part of a chapter of the second part of the dissertation. The dissertation was, as you mentioned at the beginning, and this is also the book, sort of a broad history of the practice of agrarian development in Ethiopia from the Italian occupation through the war, the Second World War, until the early post-war start of international and US aid. So the first part of the book was more on specific dynamics that had to do with the continuities in ideologies and practices between the Italians and the Americans in the 50s. And the second part was on specific crops. So I worked on wheat, and the article was the sort of the start of the chapter, and on cotton and on coffee. So it took some changes, of course, from dissertation to book, but it's almost done, and I hope I will be able to submit the proposal and the manuscript soon.
That's exciting to have more than one crop, because I feel that usually histories choose one crop or one thing. So I think that's also, we consider them all consumer goods and globally exportable consumer goods, but I can imagine that you're also looking at longer traditions of production.
I mean, how can I write a history of agrarian development without mentioning coffee, for example?
I know.
Which is so crucial, and cotton too. Cotton, probably most of all crops that I worked on in this case, was the one that was most valued by experts from the fascist occupation to the US .4 program in the 50s.
Yeah. I think exciting that you did all three, or that you're doing all three. We're going to start wrapping up. I have a couple questions. First, I'm going to say again, having a submission from agricultural history is really exciting. And I was wondering, do you want to share a little information about what it was like publishing with them? Is there anything as an Italianist that was really exciting or different about, they are so happy about your article. They made it openly access so that everyone can read it in order to celebrate it. So, and they were very happy to have someone working on Italian agricultural history, especially fascism, working in Africa. So what was your experience working with them?
It was probably, yeah, if I know already that it will be one of the best experience with publishing that I will have. They've been great from the very beginning. I have to say that I first presented this article at one of the conferences. Then it was my first journal targets from the very beginning, and they've been extremely helpful. The editor. The reviews also were very supportive, critical but supportive. So I think that the article definitely improved a lot thanks to the reviews. So I'm very thankful also to the reviewers, and yeah, all the publicity, the help that they provided me with from also getting the article open access. And that's also thanks to the Society for Italian Historical Studies. So I warmly recommend all Italian historians to submit articles to the journal because they are a fantastic team. There's over the years, there's been a few Italian or Italianist historians that have published with them, but there's always room for more. So
no, I think it's a great idea for the future to go into interdisciplinary and to non-geographically specific. I mean, it's wonderful. You get more people learning about Italy. All right, I posted online if anyone had questions for you, and I got a question from Professor Lucy Ryle, and she wanted to know, how do you think an emphasis on non-human actors, in your case, environmental history, can change the narrative of modern Italian history? Now, that's a hard question. If you don't want to answer, you don't have to, but she wrote, I'd love to hear what Michele says about this. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about this too. So telling history is not about people, but about things, or about focusing on change in environment instead of change in politics. Where do you see that bringing modern Italian history?
Yeah, that's of course that's since the time I've been starting to read and also write about non-human agents, modern human agents, with respect to the history of fascism and the history of Italian agricultural development. This has sort of always been one of the key questions that I had in mind. I don't know to what extent I'm able to respond to this in a broader sense, to the broder field of Italian historical studies, but I can try to make a few examples.
No, anything.
There's a fantastic quote that I found a couple of months ago from an Italian agricultural scientist from the early 20th century that talks about the role of wind, for example, in the history of southern Italian farming. And I think he also mentions rust, which is the fungus that I talk about in the article. And he calls these the familiar demons of Italian farming, which I think is a beautiful way of putting it. So entities that are non-human, but they are always there. They are familiar with they are familiar entities within the horizon, the cultural, the social, the economic, the political horizon of farmers in southern Italy. And I think it's in this sense that I'm trying to integrate the history of non-human agents. Not necessarily, I mean, the question of agency is always complicated to grapple with, but it's definitely in the words of the actors, historical actors themselves. Wind, rust, seeds themselves. It's something that they have a relationship with, that they do not just use but interact. I think the case of rust is really like paradigmatic in that sense, because in the case in the case of the article, for example, of How to Feed an Empire, but also in other cases, it's really interesting to see how as soon as Italian farmers, Italian scientists develop new ways to defeat this fungus. This fungus itself, over just one season, changes and develops itself in new forms, in new genetic ways that allow it to then counterattack. So there is really a very interesting relationship here that could be broadened in so many different respects, as I think many Italian environmental historians are already doing. So the question of a non-human agency with respect to Italian, especially Italian environmental history, it's something that not just I am doing, but also several others, environmental historians.
Well, this is unfortunately we have to hang up because, you know, the world moves on. But I hope to meet you in person one day because I have a thousand other comments and questions. But before we let you go, and we didn't even talk about your next project, but I have a strong belief that one finishes one book before one starts talking about the other. I just want to say it was a true pleasure to read this article. I know what those sources read like. I used to work on hygenesis during the fascist period, and it was a slog. And you really wrote this in a way that made me be rooting for, worried and scared and interested in learning. And I hope more and more people read the article, and congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation, and thank you again for the Society for Italian Historical Studies as a whole for this prize.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to press stop.